So good evening, everyone, and it's fantastic to see so many people here for this 33rd Wellington lecture. Good evening, welcome, distinguished guests, Your Grace, Deputy Lord Lieutenant. You're all most welcome to this evening's lecture. In fact, there's two things happening tonight. We've got the lecture coming up shortly, which I'll introduce, and then we have the prize, Wellington Prize, and it's really great to be. For those who don't know me, my name is Mark Smith and I'm the Vice Chancellor here at the university. It's a huge pleasure to play this role because you get to see the rich wealth of things that go across the university, all the way from arts and humanities to medicine to science. So it's really fantastic. And tonight we're going to hear the 33rd Wellington lecture, which is going to be presented by Professor Beatrice de Graaf. Beatrice, you're very welcome to the university. Professor de Graaf is one of Europe's most highly respected experts on the history of terrorism and security. So we're going to hear about that in a second. She's Chair of History and International Relations and Global Governance at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. She studied German languages, culture and modern history at Bonn and Utrecht, and with her PhD thesis in 2004. She held a visiting fellowship at St Catherine's College, Cambridge, and in 2018 she received the Steven Prize, which is the highest academic distinction in the Netherlands. So clearly we're in the hands of an expert this evening. With an ERC, that's jargon, that means European Research Council Consolidator grant, Beatrice founded the Security History Network and studies with her team of how security is being historicised since 1800. Her books including Fighting Terror After Napoleon, How Europe Became Secure After 1815, which was published by the Cambridge University Press in 2020. And she's recently won the 2022 Duke de Arenberg Prize for the best book on European history. So as I said, we've got someone with impeccable credentials to give this lecture, and which is a distinguished series of lectures about one of the most important figures in British history. So that's enough from me. You didn't come here tonight to hear me talk. You came here to hear the main lecture. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Beatrice to give her lecture, which is L'Homme de l'Europe Revisited, the Duke of Wellington and the Fight Against Terror in post-Napoleonic Europe. Thank you very much, Beatrice.
Sorry, just to get this started. That's all right. Yeah. Good. So, thank you so very much, dear Vice Chancellor, Your Grace, ladies and gentlemen, for this invitation tonight. Very happy to share some of the findings with you. And I was wondering a little bit whether I could bring this in Southampton, but I think I can. And you will know why I'm posing this question later on in this lecture. On February the 3rd, 1825, a devastating flood swept over the North Sea coast from Denmark to Germany to the Netherlands. Almost 800 people perished in the Netherlands. The newly created Kingdom of the Netherlands mobilized a tremendous fundraising effort for the victims and the people that suffered from the floods. More than 2 million guilders were collected, and interestingly, the solidarity with the flooded kingdom stretched abroad as well. Many large-scale donations came in from foreign donors. In 1826, various commemoration books were published, including the lists of the donations and the donors. On top of the list was the Duke of Wellington, next to the King of the Netherlands and the Russian Tsar. The Prince of Waterloo, Marshal of His Majesty the King, had donated the astonishing and liberal amount of 1,200 guilders, the equivalent of what would be now around 15,000 euros, to the northern parts of the Netherlands that were flooded. The flood coincided, and the commemoration books coincided with another mentioning of the Duke of Wellington in the Netherlands. It was the erection, the creation of the National War Monument of the Netherlands, the Lion of Waterloo, high over the plains below Brussels that same year. Here again, the Prince of Waterloo was commemorated for being one of the prime defenders of God, the fatherland, and the peace of Europe in times of great distress. An association was created in the Netherlands to keep the memory of the victory and the protagonists alive, with the King William I, the Dutch king's second son, Frederick, as patron. And a steady stream of memorabilia, insignia, poems, leaflets, memoirs, and children's books kept flowing through the Dutch public sphere, with Pieneman's masterpiece commissioned by the King of the Netherlands himself as the epitaph of the Waterloo cult. Interestingly, Waterloo and the role of the House of Orange were put together on a pedestal, oftentimes flanked by the persona of Wellington, Lucia, and some other allied princes or generals, but most predominantly the hero of Waterloo, the Prince of Waterloo himself, the Duke of Wellington. In a well-known Dutch children's book, a Dutch grandfather urges his grandson to watch over his Waterloo medal and always speak in awe of the Duke of Wellington. The Prince of Waterloo was venerated in the Netherlands not just as a military hero, but also as a character of great moral valor, hence the publication of his donation, and at the same time portrayed and viewed as a true statesman, bestowing upon the Netherlands the hallmark of international relevance. Moreover, this veneration did not only look back to Waterloo, it also looked to the future, because at that time Wellington was also in memory of the Dutch public as the commander and the chair of the Allied Council that kept fighting terror after 1815. He didn't go home after 1815. And that's the main bit of what my talk will be about tonight. For the Netherlands, the Duke of Wellington and the Allied Council, more about that in a minute, mattered. It was part of a new, a prudent and benign European order that was lauded in the Dutch newspapers as wise and moderate. Britain was part of that, Prussia, France, Portugal, Russia, and even after 1818, France again. And it would be in Europe's and in the Netherlands' best interest to maintain peace and hence fight the terror. So remarkably, in the years and decade after 1814, 1815, while Wellington in the UK would increasingly come under pressure from radical criticism on his domestic and conservative policies, his image and influence on the continent was considered in a far more benign and nuanced light. Therefore, tonight, I would like to question the Duke of Wellington's reputation in British-dominated historiography and press, focus on his role after 1814 as the liberal whisperer behind the throne. Yes, you're hearing it correctly. The liberal whisperer behind the throne. That's the part that I was wondering whether I could bring it tonight, but I will. So what do I mean with whisperer, and what do I mean with liberal, and how on earth can we connect that epitaph to the Iron Duke? So first, why is a revisited view on Wellington's foreign political and diplomatic activities warranted? Well, because in the historiography on post-1815 restoration, far too much attention has been spent on military matters, military achievements, seen through the lens of one-sided nationalist narratives, British narratives, Prussian narratives, Dutch, French, not on European narratives. Tonight's narrative will be truly European, because the Duke of Wellington was a European Duke as well. It has also been far too much on domestic political activities, seen through what we could call the Whiggish interpretation of history, which sees the post-1815 history as a revival of ancient regime dark ages, only lightening up after the Spring of Peoples in 1848. And we could argue that the literature that focuses on the domestic alone is partly flawed, because it wasn't just the theology towards the revolutions and more democracy. You cannot just disconnect the domestic from the foreign, the internal politics from the international politics. They're connected, they're entangled. And that's why I consider Wellington's role as a bridge to bring together the disjoint branches in academia of imperial colonial history, diplomatic and domestic political history. We need to bring them back together to do historical justice to Wellington as an innovative and creative diplomat, not just as a general. So, with my monograph, Fighting Terror After Napoleon, I've already tried to demonstrate how Paul Schroeder, he's a very famous, influential historian, postulated the transformation of Europe and how that was put into practice. It was operationalized on the ground by the Allied machine. The Allied machine, that was the phrase that was coined by Castlereagh and Wellington themselves. They used that term to delineate the committee that was created on the basis of the Quadruple Alliance and the Paris Treaty in 1815, after Napoleon was vanquished, between the four main victors, between Prussia, Russia, Austria and Britain. And Castlereagh was chair of that committee. If he wasn't in town, it was Wellington. So he was both general of the Army of Occupation and chairman of the Allied Council. That combined not just military matters, but also economics, finances, foreign relations and French domestic policies between 1814 and 1818 to inaugurate a modern system of greater and smaller states cooperation that try to quell a new revolution, fight terror, and install moderation. So why am I bringing this up? Well, it seems timely to revisit the Duke of. It seems time to visit the role of the Duke of Wellington as British emissary on the continent. We had a revival of studies on revolutionary Napoleonic themes over the past years, books like this. The bicentennial of the creation of the Dutch Kingdom in 2013, the Congress of Vienna 2015, the celebration of Waterloo in 2015, the Peterloo Massacre in 2019. They all sparked books and monographs, but politics and diplomatic endeavors from a more unified European perspective, books from a unified European perspective, are still lacking. They received short shrift. Brian Vicks and Glenda Sluga's work exempted, of course. So most attention still is on the national perspective. We could also question the bad press that Wellington received in the UK, not just now, but also back then. Rory Muir, the great Wellington biographer, and John Bew, the great Castlereagh biographer, have already demonstrated that the bad press against both Castlereagh and Wellington was engineered not only in the 20th or 21st century by historians, but that vitriolic campaigns against the Duke were already launched by opponents at the time itself. Not just by radical poets, but, for example, also by Prime Minister Canning, who declared Wellington's missions and diplomatic overtures a failure, for example in 1826 when the Duke went to St. Petersburg, before the Duke even got started. And of course, as Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington became the beloved whipping boy for radical pundits. Cruikshank's caricatures even found a receptive audience far beyond the British Isles. You all are aware of these caricatures. So therefore, to counterbalance these one-dimensional, yet still quite active caricatures, it may be more helpful not to look on the British side of things, but from the foreign corridors of policy making, from the European corridors, Belgian, Dutch, French, German corridors, to calibrate the perception of Wellington as a politician and a statesman, and to apply an outside perspective on the man who was coined in Europe, l'homme de l'Europe, the man of Europe. Wellington was actively involved in restoration politics after 1814 on the continent. He was physically present in France, in Spain, in the Netherlands, in Russia in the decade after 1815, not as a general field marshal, but explicitly in a more political and diplomatic role, operating behind the scenes, working for the alliance in peacetime, working for the art restoration, return of looted artwork, and many more things beyond. And this part of his work has not been vastly covered, has not been covered at all, pretty much. At home, by mouth of the Whigs and the isolationist Tories, he was associated with ancient regime politics of repression and censorship, epitomized in the alleged Holy Alliance conspiracies. Abroad, much of Wellington's machinations, they were kept behind the scenes on purpose by royals who did not very much like to be seen as Wellington's partners or Albion's puppets, as they would have been called by their own domestic opposition. So, that brings me to my whisperer part. When in preparation for the final wars of the Seventh Coalition, the Prussian Chief of Staff Gneisenau delegated General Karl von Muffling as liaison to Wellington's headquarters for the Waterloo campaign. And he gave his protege some very explicit advice. He said, "Be careful," quote, "Wellington, by his relations with India and his transactions with the deceitful nabobs," local Indian rulers, "this distinguished general has so accustomed himself to duplicity that he had at last become such a master in the art as even to outwit the nabobs themselves." In other words, be aware of Wellington. He will outwit you politically, diplomatically, at any corner. And indeed, Wellington had served as a general in India, had learned from his times there, had observed with his own brother, amongst others, that it would be quite convenient and advantageous not to sit on the throne yourself, but to employ your advice and influence behind the throne, the whisperer behind the throne. Something his peers were well aware of. And in the literature, the metaphor of the whisperer behind the throne is embedded in the context of colonial rule, where more often than not, in times of colonization, imperial interventions, local princes were kept in office in colonial protectorates, be they sultan, bey, tribal chief, king, or otherwise, but they were given a sidekick in the person of a European imperial agent. This agent would be appointed a mere civilian officer, a military advisor, would in reality be the one in the shadows, behind the throne, pulling the strings. And although the notion of indirect rule is connected to colonial situation, we could identify a similar context in Europe after 1814. Not in the least because many so-called men on the spot in 1814 had gained their experience in governance in colonial settings. For example, the Duke of Richelieu came back in September 1815 to govern France as a prime minister, and he had been governor in the Crimea, where he had colonized the area for Catherine the Great on her behalf. Justus von Gruner, the Prussian administrator, had risen through the ranks in the eastern Prussian colonies as master of bureaucratic efficiency, was appointed by the Allied Council, by Hardenberg, the Chancellor of Prussia, and Wellington, to set up an Allied secret service in Paris to support the army of occupation. Don't know if you know that, but Wellington also created the first international European secret intelligence service in 1815 after the armistice with the French, and records of that service are still there to browse. And Wellington himself had, of course, made his career in India. And we could argue that in France, after 1815, from the 7th of July 1815 onwards, indirect rule was enacted by the instrument of military occupation. 1.5 million soldiers, and then from 1816 onwards, 150,000 Allied soldiers were deployed along a broad strip of French lands along the northern and eastern borders. 2/3 of the French territory, and later on a little bit less, was colonized, was occupied by the Allied forces. And the situation was consolidated by the treaties of Paris, the Quadruple Alliance, creating a system not just overseeing the stabilization of France, but also the reordering of Europe after the Congress of Vienna. Far too much attention is devoted to the Congress of Vienna, but the Congress of Vienna would have been mere paperwork had not Napoleon come back again. And during the Congress of Vienna on the 7th of March, 1815, he came back again. Hadn't he come back, I doubt, it could be a counterfactual case, I doubt the Congress of Vienna would have had that much effect. But because Napoleon came back and he had to be fought off a second time, and this time the Allied forces pledged to stay put until not just Napoleon was vanquished, but France was stabilized again. So the whole idea of the army of occupation, the Allied Council, the Allied Secret Service only was implemented in France after the return and the second defeat of Napoleon. It was far more influential than the Congress of Vienna was. And this whole project was chaired, overseen, run by the Duke of Wellington. And this imperial system was, of course, embedded in a Western civilized context in France, but with the vast subsidies, the military support, the overbearing sense of triumph and domination, the Allied partners did create a situation of inequality, hierarchy, independence, and at least the Prussian generals liked to behave like colonial rulers in France. I mean, they had reason to, but they did. And French people lamented this. For example, the French writer, Napoleonic nemesis, Madame de Staël, aimed her pen at Wellington. "How could you," she said, "you are the British liberator. How could you allow those 150,000 foreigners to defile my homeland? My true French heart cannot stand," she wrote to him, "the presence of foreign troops. Please imagine that in front of Apsley House, thousands of Frenchmen would be camping in Hyde Park. You would hate it." Wellington sort of acquiesced, and he went to great lengths to reconcile himself to her, and he visited her almost daily on her deathbed in 1817. But he did not pull away any of the troops. In fact, with the inauguration of the Allied machine, the consortium composed of the princes and the generals representing the countries that I just mentioned, it was clear where the cards were dealt and by whom. In Paris, from the British embassy, Castlereagh and Wellington, in tandem, on a daily basis, at 11 o'clock in the morning, they convened to run the show, to rule France and Europe. Either they were drinking hot chocolate or coffee. We all know that from the archives. It's amazing. It's all being kept together. And the French were only invited as bearers of new commands and commissions, so they were not part of that committee properly. And immediately from the outset, Castlereagh, the foreign minister, disseminated a memorandum on the principles of salutary precaution in Europe, assembling the Allied Council in Paris and outlining the principles for dealing with France. And one of the central principles out of the four, setting up hierarchy of powers, making the French pay, very important, also pay back the looted artwork, very important, expanding the scope, working together better, but the second principle is perhaps the most important, stabilizing France through the instruments of French government. And here we can see Wellington at work. The Allies subscribed to the British memorandum declaring to support the legitimate King Louis XVIII to uphold and confirm his royal authority. And the personification of this indirect rule, the whisper of the throne, was the Duke of Wellington. Not only did he enjoy the confidence of all other Allied commanders, including Metternich and Tsar Alexander, he also had the ear of Louis XVIII himself. He spoke fluently French, had a clear idea on how to approach things, and upon the king's arrival in Paris, commissioned by the Allied Council, Wellington set out to convince the king to subscribe once again to the Charte Constitutionnelle that had been adopted in 1814, short-livedly. This is an interesting part as well, because it's missing from the French textbooks. It's as if the king came back and adopted the constitution all by himself, but he had to receive some urging and some nudging and some pressuring by the Allied Council, by the mouth of Wellington himself. So from Wellington's dispatches, all lodged here at Southampton, a true treasure trove here, but also compounded by contemporary historians in France who say, for example, the British influence upon the king was so substantial that the king's brother, Monseigneur, the later Charles X, soon came to resent the semi-colonial episode and started to get a real hatred towards Wellington. Not just because he was a colonial ruler, but because Wellington effectively blocked the attempts by the ultra-royalists around the later Charles X to achieve unified radical monarchist advocacy over the king. And he kept urging the king to cooperate with Parliament, to stick to the Constitution, to operate with moderation, accept parliamentary reforms, enact reconciliation, because for Wellington this served the security. You have to imagine, he was not a lofty politician with lofty European ideals per se. He was there to re-implement, to restore security. fighting terror, restoring security, because a secure continent, a stable and a moderate continent, was in the best British interest. So it's not idealism per se, it's strategic considerations as such. But these strategic considerations made him, here's Wellington holding the king back from Ghent, where he fled to during the 100-day period. And here's Wellington to Bathurst. I conceived the best security for Europe was the restoration of the king. And because otherwise we'll have new endless wars. So we need a king and we need a constitution. And we need liberal reforms. So this brings me to the liberal part, which is a quite fascinating part. In the above, I already touched upon Wellington's attempts to moderate and tone down ultra-royalism in France, the White Terror, if you like. But did this make him a liberal? You wonder. Not, of course, in a party political ideological sense, but you could make an argument, and I'm trying to set it up here, that in the mode of governance, in the international European sphere of the late 1810s, 1820s, it was. Because what did liberal entail back then? Several things. If you browse to the newspapers in 1815, liberalism was oftentimes equated with radicalism, as in overturning all feudal privileges and implementing a government based on individual liberties. Well, that's obviously not what Wellington wanted. But liberal could also point to a mode of governance based on constitutional rule, a breach from ancient regime divine rule, and hence the quite authoritarian king of the Netherlands, put on the throne in 1813, could complement his ministers with a liberal sketch for a constitution. And the king himself was applauded for tolerance and liberal rule in the Netherlands as such, although he was not a liberal to any of our standards today, but it was considered liberal by the contemporaries. In Britain, liberal was of course reserved for the Whig party that turned into the Liberal Party later in the 18th century, but again, as a mode of governance, as opposed to the full ideological party, liberal could be applied to specific reforms. Abolition of slavery was a liberal reform. Catholic emancipation, which Wellington advocated. Repeal of the Corn Laws. Abolishing censorship. It was the art of balancing between ancient regime and modern reforms, between royal prerogative and constitutional accountability. Liberalism was indeed a subjective perception, an attribution projected and attributed to a political friend or an enemy. It was an instrument in discourse. In the media, liberal was seen as good, and you were good if you were a true liberal. But it was dependent on your position. For example, being a liberal in Prussia, Chancellor Hardenberg was considered a liberal in a Prussian context, could still make you a staunch authoritarian ruler in Britain or in the Netherlands. And in the liberal British press, Wellington was always the bad copper, the nosy bully. But in the Dutch liberal press, his liberal behavior, his generous and liberal donations, his performance on behalf of the Dutch population made him liberal in the Dutch context. So in the international arena, it was more dependent on the point of view, time and situation. And we see here why it's important to bridge that gap between domestic and foreign history. I pointed to Wellington's influence in making Louis XVIII king against the wishes of the ultra-royalists accepting the renewed charter, and a similar discussion occurred in October 1815 when the Allied Council debated the fate of the Ionian Isles, formerly part of the Venetian Republic, conquered by Napoleon, reconquered by the British forces. And in the Allied Council, the fate of this part of what now is Greece was also discussed, and the Allied ministers voted for the creation of the United States of the Ionian Isles. Wellington and Castlereagh made the case that this new kingdom, this new protectorate, should have a legal administration, a liberal constitution, and a parliament. Only if the other authoritarian powers would consent in that would they give them trade privileges in this United States of the Ionian Isles. So you see here again a kind of a liberalizing a constitutional effect. Wellington's whisper abroad was indeed far more liberal than the press back home had it. Let me share with you another very fascinating period. When Wellington was asked to mediate between the new Kingdom of the Netherlands and the Allied Council in a very interesting conflict. It was the case of French radicals who had found a refuge in the Netherlands. In the more conservative, absolutist monarchies of post-1815 Europe, the police state was very vigorous and did not guarantee civil rights much. But in the few countries where liberal government was in power, or where liberal opposition could make itself heard in parliament, and where there were constitutional liberties, for example Britain, the Netherlands, Baden, some other German principalities, parts of Poland, people were given free rein to publish and to write, and they did so. And that is why a steady stream of radicals, former terrorists even, Bonapartists, fled France after the political climate became increasingly oppressive there. They fled France and they settled in French-speaking Brussels from July 1815 onwards, including the regicides Manin de Douai, Garnier de Saint, Cambacère, the painter David Sieyès, even Fouché, and the police minister himself, and many other convention members, and former Napoleonic generals, Lobau, Vandamme, Davout, Cuneo, Donano. They sought each other out in salons, they founded newspapers such as Le Surveillant, or they engaged in liberal radical newspapers such as Le Ningeon. Napoleon's general excellence was heard proclaiming in Brussels salons that Ney would be avenged. Remember, the Marshal was being executed by the French in 1815. That is why French diplomats started to complain in The Hague, and when the Dutch king did not respond, they started to file complaints with the Allied Commission. You have to do something about this nest of libellers in Brussels. And the council deliberated vigorously from February 1816 onwards. But King William I, the Dutch king, even after repeated requests, he refused to introduce tighter press regulation. He did not arrest them or expulse the French refugees because he could not. He was bound to the new constitution that had just been adopted in August 1815. He could not change the basic law even if he wanted to, and he didn't really. And the Austrian Emperor, Metternich, and the Tsar, they now all went to Wellington and asked him to put an end to this and to perhaps even take the Allied troops, the Allied forces who were camped, as you remember, in the north of France, just below the Dutch border, move into the Netherlands to make them listen, those armed Jacobins in the Netherlands. And here Wellington had to perform one of his major balancing acts. On the one hand, he had the enraged sovereigns of Europe in his neck. On the other, the Dutch King William, the Dutch constitution, and for example, Wellington was always quite sensitive to female complaints. The young wife, the beautiful young wife, I should say, of General Lobau, who came to visit him and to convince him of the fact that the husband was not, in any case, dangerous anymore, was decidedly harmless. So, indeed, in June and December 1817, Wellington wrote a lengthy report and handed that over to the Allied Council. And in the report, and this is really very fascinating, he first explains to the Allied sovereigns that a new generic alien bill, for example, the category of crimes against the state, security of the state, high treason, could not be introduced in the Netherlands because it was not in the constitution. And it would require amendments of the constitution. And Wellington now found himself in the position of defending the Dutch liberal basic law and the Dutch political system to the Allied Council. And in April 1870, you can read a lengthy report where he teaches the Allied princes a basic introductory course on constitutionalism, passing through a fundamental piece of legislation in a system with two parliamentary chambers is a highly intricate and difficult business, Wellington lectures the princes. The council cannot undermine a newly erected kingdom because the Netherlands have been created the lapdog of the great powers. Not so nice a metaphor, but it's true. So they can now not just overturn and upend the Dutch constitution or the bicameral system of the Netherlands. So in the end, the Prussians, the Russians, and the Austrians formally still protested against that strange Dutch tolerance. What kind of constitution is it, Metternich asked Wellington, that keeps one from acting against such libels? You just should be able to arrest people who write nasty things about you. But Wellington knew that you just couldn't do that. He couldn't do that in Britain either. So they accepted Wellington's exposé and the defense of Dutch civil liberties and liberal press law and did not invade the Netherlands with the army of occupation. Quite an astonishing result, the more so since in Britain, with the Spa field riots, no such reluctance vis-à-vis radicals was observed. So interesting. A last case. A case where Wellington's attempts to be liberal and to act as a moderate reformer failed. Also very interesting. You can already see why it failed. The King of Spain is the main obstacle. The King of Spain was too hard a reactionary nut to crack, if I may say so. So it was not just the revolutionary terror, but the reactionary terror that came to haunt Wellington in his attempt to implement a moderate system of collective security and reforms in Europe. It was King Ferdinand of Spain who had been restored to his throne after his captivity in France in 1814 to immediately abolish the constitution upon his return. He curtailed the freedom of the press, began to arrest, detain members of the liberal faction all over the country. Castlereagh and Wellington, upon hearing the news, were horrified, very afraid that the country for which liberation British troops had paid so dearly, the whole Iberian campaign was waged there, would again become a hotbed for revolution and civil war. Bar all the solutions, Wellington immediately had to leave Paris, it was after the first defeat of Napoleon in 1814, to convince Ferdinand to adopt a new liberal constitution again. He put heavy pressure on the Spanish court, he threatened, he tried to pursue and convince, and indeed after a couple of weeks of arguing with the king and holding British subsidies ransom to Madrid, he succeeded, but only briefly. So what we see here is a Wellington in action who expressed a deep loathing for the absolutist mindset of Ferdinand and his supporters, although he also complained about the radical rigidity of the liberals, but he went to Madrid to support the consolidation of a moderate, tolerant and rule-based government. But the Spanish government, the reactionary government of Spain, left Wellington quite exasperated because only a couple of years later, 4 years later, in 1818, they tried again. Spanish and Portuguese envoys approached Wellington in Paris at the Allied Council, addressing him again as the l'homme de l'Europe and demanding from him to sail to the Americas to restore order and security there in the Second Hemisphere, as he had done in Europe. The Allied ministers convened about his requests to settle the territorial disputes and fight terror in the Americas. And they even discussed the possibility to give Wellington the command over an Allied expeditionary force composed of British and Dutch maritime forces with the intention to deploy an army of occupation in the Americas and settle matters there as they had done in France. Well, Wellington carefully considered the request, even laid out operational details, but his conclusion was quite inevitable. He could not and really would not occupy the Americas. And what was most, he didn't want it because it didn't fit the spirit of the times. As he wrote, the conflict in the Americas is a by-battle. Spain is far too jealous and illiberal, Wellington writes, to take any advice from him before. The word liberty was not part of the political vocabulary. Very interesting. So since the courts would not agree to any kind of reform or change, Wellington had to inform the ministers that he would not be able and willing to set the Allied machine in motion and sail to South America. He didn't want to play that tune. So, very fascinating case study in history, this. Coming to an end, in conclusion, what does this all teach us about the role of the Duke of Wellington as a British politician, a diplomat on the continent? Well, on the one hand, this paper can be considered an attempt to contextualize, revisit his role as a diplomat and statesman in Europe after 1815, especially his role as a chairman of the Allied Council. It's not at all intended to posthumously elevate the British Empire to a state of a liberal and a benign one. This is not my intention. My attempt has been to historicize, to open the perspective on Wellington's politics, diplomatic politics as such in the late 1810s and 1820s. We discussed this before. There's not a proper book on diplomacy and politics in the 1810s and 1820s in Europe. It's just not there. It's all considered Dark Ages, Restoration, but it's not true. It was highly innovative, it was highly experimental. What Wellington did was that he broadened the playing field in the international arena in Paris substantially. He used his extraordinary reputation and the transitional times after 1815 to push for reforms, to push for innovation in Spain, to push for a constitution in France, in the Ionian Isles. He defended the Dutch constitution with vigor. Obviously, he did that with all the power, finances and leverage and reputation great power Britain brought into the field. And he was, of course, defending British international and security interests. But in doing so, he showed himself far more open and indulgent to new arrangements than he was in his own country. I think this is perhaps one of the tragic elements of the story. Abroad, Wellington knew that the true opposite and the true remedy to terror was liberal reform. At home, he was far too much confused, perhaps, or anxious to apply the same politics. We could have a discussion on this later on. So, abroad, conservatives like Wellington could be liberal. They could be far more open-minded, cosmopolitan, even far more innovative, as their allegedly liberal opponents in politics were. Take, for example, Canning, who was urging, or at least allowing, the Russians to destroy the Ottomans at Navarino, where Wellington tried to stave that off. So what I do hope is that this lecture gives us some food for thought, rethinking Wellington, rethinking his role after 1815, rethinking international politics after 1815, European security after 1815 as well. The men on the spot, as they were, they enjoyed a tremendous level of freedom and autonomy. They were hardly reined in by their courts or parliaments, and they were able to make their own pragmatic decisions. And we could argue in some instances that with the rise of representative democracy, party rule, populists and populist strongholds started to put a far heavier leash on political leaders. We're urging them after 1830s towards a far more expansionist, aggressive direction than the autonomous statesmen and diplomats in the 1810s and 1820s did. As Wellington once wrote, despotism in the hand of the mob is far worse than power in the hands of one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for a wonderful lecture. I'm Mark Caldwell from the History Department. I have the pleasure of chairing 15 minutes of questions. We have got some microphones moving, and they will find you. So, yes, sir.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating, if I may say so. You've given a couple of examples where Wellington made recommendations to the Allied Council, and they accepted his recommendations. The Council consisted of representatives of three autocracies. I think it's fair to say Prussia, Austria, Russia. Was there any complaint from people like Metternich, for example, that Wellington was being too liberal, in your sense?
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much. The thing was that they were amongst each other so fearful and watchful and wary. Metternich was mostly watchful against the Russians, against the French as well, that for him, Wellington was his kind of, well, not savior, but perhaps of safety vault for the whole system. So he gave Wellington almost free rein, because Wellington indeed was working towards a new balance of power system that served Metternich's ends. So Metternich was, again, not an idealist, but what Wellington was doing with collective security in Europe served Metternich as well, staving the French off, putting the Russians a bit back in the east. And Metternich was, in fact, so happy with what Wellington did that when Metternich was expelled or fled Vienna after the Spring of Revolutions broke out in Vienna, he came to London and he tried to find in Wellington his old friend. But Wellington was not so keen on rekindling that friendship, because I don't think for Wellington it was a real friendship.
Could I ask a question about, you mentioned
Yes, and there's a question. Yeah.
just the Allied Secret Service you mentioned. I wanted to know a little bit more about that, about the targets of this Secret Service and how did it develop, or Who was it targeting?
Yes, that's a fascinating story as well. I'm still trying to find more materials because I was showing you that there's not one single location where the files can be found. You have to stitch them together. They're numbered, the protocols, so you can count them by there's more than 380 or so. So you can find them in all these archives where I found bits and pieces of the archives. And the Allied Secret Service reported to the Allied Council, and those reports are in the minutes. And Justus von Grune was the head of the Allied Secret Service, and he was a former Prussian police officer, was hired by Metternich, hired by Hardenberg, and appointed also by Wellington and Metternich. And he had, and this is brilliant, he had to identify and register the fake news, the fausse nouvelle. So falsche Gerüchte in German, or fausse nouvelle in French. So he really wrote it down. I have pictures of that, but not here now. I have a chapter in my book written on that, because since Napoleon, people knew that l'esprit, or since the revolution, l'esprit public, what the people think, is pivotal. And if they think badly of you, they may rise as a mob and they may take you over. So from the French Revolution onwards, the notion of what the people thought became increasingly more important. It had already been important, of course, during Louis XVI and the ancient regime. But now they started to collect on a more centralized scale, linking also together with the other Allied secret services, all kind of fausse nouvelle, falsche Gerüchte that were out there. And then they were mainly targeting Bonapartists, and also the what they called the Napoleonides, the relatives and the family of Napoleon. For example, Hortense de Beauharnais. They suspected her of running a whole scheme of spies and plots and following her through Europe. So people like that. It's a new lecture. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. I have a question in particular about Wellington's relationship to these continental constitutions. And you mentioned that his understanding of liberal means the primacy of constitutional rule. Did Wellington himself have sort of any particular ideology regarding these written constitutions in Europe, such as the Charter or the Spanish Constitution? Were they means to liberal reforms, or were they sort of an end in and of themselves, given sort of the novelty of these written constitutions at the time?
That's a great question, and I once had a thought, and perhaps you can continue that, to write a paper on Wellington's ideology. But I'm not sure whether he had an ideology. His ideology as a politician in Europe, which was again different from his views and beliefs in England, I think, in Britain, his view on Europe was very much the epithet fighting terror, because there just had been a total war of 25 years, revolutionary Napoleonic warfare. 5 million people died. Upheaval, everything was upended. Not just people were dead, but also possessions, monies, land, territories. And if Wellington had an ideology, he had a very strong belief in the hierarchy of powers as they had organically developed over time. So kings and queens could not just be toppled. And there was another treaty, which I think was very much dictated also by Wellington, the Treaty of 15th of March 1815, 1 week after the landing of Napoleon. It was called the Treaty on Mutual Security. It laid the basis for the Quadruple Alliance. And in this treaty, it stated that the countries of Europe will fight terror together, also in peacetime. And they considered Napoleon outside the pale of civilization. And why? Because he had killed the Duc d'Enghien. So he had done away with not just ordinary infantry and soldiers, but with the hierarchy of Europe. So for Wellington, hierarchy, organic, layered stratification of society was very important. Yet, the constitutions were for him a very important instrument, perhaps almost ideal, not an ideal, but idyllic, to fight off terror. So liberal reforms, liberal constitution. There wasn't a constitution, of course, in Britain. But in the new countries, you needed a constitution to balance, to moderate all those emotions and passions that were still out there. So I do think, in fact, you're right, it's more instrumental, more transactional, but it served to create a new stable order.
If anyone can hear me, I'll just speak up. Thank you. I'm very interested in the idea of Wellington as a liberal. As a British historian, that's not the label I've... As a British historian, that's not the label I've usually applied to Wellington. But I'm wondering whether it's significant that at one point, and I forget which slide it was, you specified the years 1815 to 1830, and I wonder if Wellington is more obviously liberal in the sense of opposing autocratic government in that period, but the language of liberalism changes dramatically after July 1830, and therefore Wellington appears less liberal in that model after that date. Or if he continues to appear liberal, what do continentals make of the fact that liberalism in Britain is frequently being defined against Wellington? All the things that Wellington represents seem to be illiberal.
Well, exactly that point was kind of the starting point of my lecture, because I know that, of course, I read British historiography on Wellington, but somehow that did not tie in at all with what I was reading in the sources at the time, in the newspapers, in the Dutch and in the Prussian books on Prussian history. So it didn't fit. So that's what my lecture is trying to do, to bridge that gap between what's being said about him in Britain, which of course is true in itself enough. I mean, I'm not an expert on that. But on the continent, there was a difference. I think Wellington, how do you say it, was very relational to elements, contextual to elements like liberal reforms. If it served his purposes in creating a stable order, he would stick to them. And moderation was very much the emotional turn of history, something that historians take seriously nowadays. And I write about that in my book too. And the emotion of the day, the buzzword of the day was moderation. It was balance. It was Jane Austen. It was against the passions that throbbed the chests of men. Walter Scott describes this in Waverley very well as well. So this is very much the spirit of the day. After the terror, moderation, stabilization needs to be the order of the day. And that, of course, dissipates, I would perhaps say not only after 1830, but perhaps already starting in 1826, 28.
I think we've got time for one more question.
So no one is really upset?
Mine is not so much a question, if I may, but following on your theme, there is a very interesting correspondence between Wilberforce and Wellington. Because when Wellington was appointed British ambassador to Paris, one of his first objectives was to persuade the King of France to abolish the slave trade. And he did indeed succeed in doing that. Of course, the king wasn't there for very long. But in any event, he did persuade the king. And Wilberforce was so pleased with Wellington. And there is a correspondence before he went to Paris. Wilberforce writes to him and sends him a copy of his book on slavery. And Wellington responds, "Thank you very much for your copy. I just want you to know I had already read it." And I think that's quite interesting. And I have the copy that Wilberforce sent in the library at Stratford, say, from the author.
Oh, that's brilliant. I'd love to see that at some point. Yeah. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful and very important anecdote. And not just an anecdote, it's an argument to make for the case that, again, here there is something that I also briefly mentioned in my lecture, abolition of slavery is a liberal reform. The question is, of course, what was the purpose and the intention behind this? So it was partly domestic pressure by Wilberforce and the big faction in England that wanted that and that tasked the British emissaries to take that to the Congress of Vienna. On the other hand, it was British interest. I mean, they would now rule the waves and they didn't need any other slave traders out there. So it was also strategic in its calculations. It was kind of outdated as such as well. So there were more strategic considerations and interests as well. But Wellington really did live up to it and played it very cleverly, because when he was in France overseeing the Allied Council, I didn't touch upon that today, but there were huge sums of money involved because France had to pay dearly to pay off for the occupation and also to make the Allies go home again. And every country of Europe flocked to Paris to take part in this preying on France. So they all want bits and parts of the millions of the French francs because they all had suffered, of course, equally from the French occupation. And then Wellington said to Spain and Portugal had not ratified the Congress of Vienna Treaty yet, because they didn't want to abolish the slave trade, that you can only sit in and join us and take your share in the French reparation money if you sign the Congress of the Vienna Treaty and abolish slavery. Otherwise, you don't get any money out of the French reparation funds. So that's very cleverly played.
Thank you very much. I'll hand you back to the Vice Chancellor.
Okay, so can we thank Beatrice again for what was a fantastic lecture? So I said at the start, you never know what you're getting in the day as a Vice-Chancellor, and this evening proved it. I've learnt a fantastic new take on the Duke of Wellington, which I'm sure we'll continue discussing afterwards. But thank you very much for that lecture. If I could just add my congratulations, Zach, as well. Fantastic. And we know how seriously the kind of judges take this, so you clearly done well for us. So many congratulations. And that draws us to the close of this evening's lecture and prize giving. It just gives me just my job to thank the Duke again, thank the Deputy Lord Lieutenant for coming, but most of all thank you for coming, because clearly events like this are part of a university's business to project kind of understanding and discussion and all that type of thing with our local community, our broader set of scholars across the country, and across all things being recorded. So it will be available to people. Thank you for coming and giving up the reading, because I know time's a very valuable commodity. So I hope that you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And so please have a safe journey home. Thank you very much.